From Koenigstein Road in the east to Casitas Gap in the west, an orange curtain has descended across the Ojai Valley. This is Ojai Talk of the Town. Hey everyone, Brett Bradigan, editor of your Ojai magazines, the monthly and quarterly. George S. Stuart, a sculptor, artist, historian, monologue expert, is our guest today. He's 95 years old, so please keep that in mind. And we really have a lot to say, and I know you're going to enjoy this one. Mr. Stuart, thank you very much for joining me. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. Here we are. I'm a big history buff myself, so to meet someone with your eminence in the field, it's a real pleasure for me.
Well, you're very gracious to entertain such a project.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of places I'd like to jump in there, but you were talking about, as a public speaker, your history.
Well, in specific, this public speaker, it was in history, the subject was history, something we have long since abandoned in our public schools. But I always thought it was more interesting than current events or a lot of other things. And so it was always a passion in my life. I was raised around people who understood history and were from the old country and all that business. So I was always intrigued by it. But as time passed, I assumed unintentionally a persona of erudition in some minds. And I want to quickly disabuse anybody of that. I am not a specialist. I do not have a degree in history. I'm a student of the subject, however, and for the last 60 or so years, I've been concentrating on history, so I've learned something about it. And I think it's very entertaining to tell people what I've discovered. And I'm encouraged to say that the effort to do so kept me alive as a public speaker for at least 45 years. And that was quite an experience for everybody.
Yeah, lovely. Now, where did you grow up? What's your background?
And as in background, what do you mean?
I mean, like, where did you grow up, like, geographically?
My parents took up residence in Pasadena. Actually, it was called Altadena.
Altadena, yeah.
And
beautiful country.
I spent the some of the Depression years there at the end, and the war years in that location.
Isn't the JPL there, and there's some other scientific facility? There's great Caltech, yes. JPL,
yeah.
a lot of good science going on there.
Well,
what did your parents do? How did they make their living? Like, what was it?
Do?
Yeah.
Well.
Besides raising you.
Oh, that was a remote affair as well. Well, my father was an aeronautical engineer, and my mother took up writing. My great aunt was a very successful author, and when she was influenced by that author to write, which she was adept in doing, and for many years worked very hard with her agent, but never published, which is too bad. The main cause being that her mystery writing was similar to another famous, or a famous author of that time.
Which would
and it was very difficult to get past that notoriety.
Was it Agatha Christie? Was she similar to Agatha?
Well,
Christie?
Agatha Christie was certainly working in that earlier than that time. No, it was Mary Roberts Reinhardt. Now, we've never heard of her today.
I do remember
And that's
that
what
name.
happens, as we in America know, the major motto is out of sight, out of mind.
Mm-hmm.
And anybody in the performance arts knows that one very well.
Yeah. Yes.
My mother had a lot of capacity, but she was not very sturdy in health.
Oh, she was fragile?
I would never refer to my mother as fragile.
No.
No. She was a very powerful presence.
Okay. But she just struggled with her health, made it difficult to commit to a career.
Well, she wasn't up to acting and performing, but we were surrounded, of course, with movie people. All our friends were in the business, and my godfather was in the movies, and I don't know, everybody we knew, or either that or German, or both.
Yeah. So what did you do? What was it like for you in the Depression? What was your experience? Just
delightful.
Was it? Or are you being ironic? I can't tell.
Well, I'm sure my parents struggled like everybody else, but my father was not a businessman. He began his life or after his teens. He was born in 1900, and of course he was like every boy growing up in the pre and war years of World War I. Aeroplanes and flight was the obsession.
Yeah.
So at the end of the war, he was deeply into learning to fly and was a licensed pilot and raced racing cars, the kind that run around in circles, and rode motorcycles. And this was his life.
Sounded like
even though he came from a farm background, he could get off the farm. He couldn't get off the farm fast enough. His older brothers could do that business. My grandfather was very successful.
Where was the farm?
The farm was in Loveland, Colorado.
Oh, yes, I know. Well, I went to school in Boulder.
Mm-hmm.
I was stationed at Lowry Air Force Base
well,
in Denver.
He landed from Germany there in 92 or so, 1892. My father was the first one born in this country. He had two older brothers and so on. But that was my father's background until he met this young woman and pursued her. And of course, it's all third person stories mostly. But she, one day, I must have been a little bit curious. I wasn't a very curious boy about my background. They were too anxious to share it in different ways, but not that. Apparently, their pursuit of the young woman was urgent and remorseless, and she didn't want to marry him or anybody else at that time. And finally, realizing her future was as an unmarried young woman, it was time to marry and start a family in that culture. And she said to him, well, I'll marry you, but you have to give up all these airplanes and racing cars and everything. And he said, yes, I will.
Okay.
I can't imagine anybody doing that for anybody else. In my life, anyway, I'm very selfish. I would never give up what was my center of my being for such a thing. But then...
Do you feel like he had any resentment about that? As though
who, me?
Your father giving
Not
up
a word. He was absolutely adoring. Anything he said or did was gospel. It was the plus ultra of our lives. She was, in his eyes, an absolute divine person.
Wow, that's really
very
sweet.
Hard.
It's hard to find that these days, I'll tell you. Yeah, I feel like my dad was the same way about my mom, and that was...
Well, it's not a healthy balance, but who's going to define a healthy balance?
Yeah.
So, we got along nicely. It was a household of 3 generations, and we did very well as far as cooperating, as best people do.
Sure. Now, I read somewhere that you once dreamed of being a Foreign Service officer.
Well, that was a little later. There was half a lifetime before I actually discovered that idea, because when I graduated from university, finally, in 1950, I guess it was, I had a total lifetime of activity in every direction until then, and managed to scrape through that and get a degree. But I was immersed in the theater and doing things that I loved doing. But I realized that my parents had been very generous in putting me through all these educational processes, and desperately desirous that I become a person of stature and accomplishment.
What did that look like for them?
Dignified position and all that business. Well, of course, that was all went to hell because I was a total blot. I couldn't do anything. I was I couldn't do anything with numbers. I was dyslexic, of course. I didn't mention that. We never heard of it. We didn't know it. A teacher said to my parents once, "Well, you're sorry, you have a charming son with good manners, but he's dim, and you'll have to live with it." Well, of course, they weren't going to live with that, and I was surrounded with tutors who, one by one, gave up. But I couldn't do anything with math, and I had no memory for anything to be tested. And so it was an awful handicap for my education. But I managed. Anyway, I knew that they'd done all this. So I thought, I've got to find something to do. Well, of course, medicine was out. I failed chemistry flat. I was pretty good in physiology, but that won't work. And law, which was a lot of lawyers in the family and a lot of doctors. And, of course, there again, you have to have a phenomenal memory. That was out. And what to do? Well, my grandmother said, well, there's only one left, and that's go into the diplomatic service, as we called it then, because at least you're civilized, and you might make something of yourself, God knows. So I knew that I found out that the path there was through the Foreign Service, which, of course, is on the other coast. But they gave examinations every year. So I, along with hundreds of other young people, went down to Los Angeles and took several days of testing, flunked the Foreign Service exam, but I was told that a lot of people do and do well after they just keep taking it until they pass, like the Manchu
Chinese
leaders.
bureaucrats.
And so I thought, well, I have to go back to the other coast for a good education and the Foreign Service at Georgetown, because that was where everybody went. Yeah. So I moved myself to the other coast. I ended up in Manhattan. I don't know why I didn't go to Washington directly, but I didn't. I spent a couple of years in New York, staying alive, working in a terrible job in Times Square, theater business, doing acting in some scrubby little theater, terrible, really ratty. Finally got a job teaching upstate a little bit at Nyack, town right across from, it's up the river, about 45 minutes from Washington Bridge. A little bit below West Point. People know the area. Mm-hmm. And it was a very handsome school, boys' school. And if you really want to know your deficiencies and weaknesses, try teaching in a private school. And it was a nightmare.
And how so?
In every way. I had never taught before. That helps to make it a nightmare. I had no understanding of children. I never was around enough children to know anything about how do you conduct yourself. Or, I didn't have a good family of siblings to knock me into shape. So it was a survival of the fittest, and I guess I had a certain amount of determination to survive, and did. And then I knew at the end of that I would have to get to Washington because that was where I was supposed to be in the first place. So I had the good fortune of some connections, and I made my way to Washington, and they admitted me to Georgetown. I can't imagine on my credits. They said, but your academic background is just so dreadful that you're going to have to start again. Well, there I was in my, well, I guess
mid-20s,
early 20s, and I began my course of study. The teachers were brilliant. It's a Jesuit school then, and the Jesuits taught us. Yeah. So there was no nonsense, no playing around with games and other rubbish that interfere with people's education today. And fortunately, I was, again, supported from home so I could stay there. And the courses were absolutely the most exciting thing that I ever had in my life. So the history course by Carol Quigley was an absolute turning point in my understanding of how history was important to me, and it should be important to others. But I flunked out.
You flunked out.
My academic level was nowhere near theirs, and the Father General, well, he wasn't the Father General, he was upstairs, the old man. But Father Fadner, who was in charge of the students, called me in and said, well, you're just not up to our academic level and you're going to have to leave. So I did. And I don't want to make a melodrama out of this, but it was a turning point. I was so crushed by this experience. Well, it really devastated me. I had never had such a terrible disappointment that day, and it was all that day. I took a bus uptown from Georgetown to a gun store that I'd seen. I don't know how I knew about it, and purchased a pistol. And I went back to my miserable little apartment in Georgetown. I had an abatement, a hole in the basement for my digs, but the apartment above me was empty. So I went upstairs, and there was a bay window overlooking the street. It's a charming neighborhood. I sat down in the bay window with my pistol in my lap. And I thought, well, you've got it, do it. But as I looked here on the seat beside me were some books somebody had left. I picked up one, P.G. Wodehouse, British author, humorist. I flipped through a few pages and began to read. And I giggled.
Yeah, he was a humorist.
Well, as you can see, the rest of the day turned out a little differently. I kept the pistol, just in case. But I realized that I had to go on, do something. Wow. I had been employed in New York in diverse ways, as I've already mentioned. But I needed a job, and I couldn't do anything. I was not prepared for anything I knew of. But I looked in the posts and the want ads, and I saw a Smithsonian institution hiring artists. Well, I thought, oh, for God's sake. Well, maybe I am an artist of some sort. So I cobbled together a little portfolio of my past activities and delivered over there. And the next day they called and wanted an interview. I went in. The following day they hired me.
And what did you present? And what was in your portfolio?
Everything I had done up there, the theater and the construction work and everything I'd done. Painting, I'd painted for years.
Okay.
made some architectural models. And I'd been making figures for the first time.
You had been doing that before you took the Smithsonian job.
That's right. When the figures burst on the scene, I knew that that was going to be something terribly important. I didn't know it would be the center of my creative life in the future. But anyway, I was back in Washington now dealing with other practicalities. And the Smithsonian, I was the third man hired in a new program called Exhibits Experts or something. My boss was a brilliant young artist, a few years my senior, maybe 3 or 4. Benjamin Lawless, brilliant fellow, good artist, just a charming man. And we just fell on each other as brothers or whatever you call it. We got along famously, laughing about how to motorize the dinosaurs and this and that. And I worked there and then had a good experience with another brilliant artist from the WPA program, Jacob Kanan, who introduced me to fine art on my lunch hours, which was, you arrived at 8 and you left at 4, and you had 45 minutes for lunch. And of course, I'm working under Dr. Kanan. He said one day, and I don't know why, he picked me out of the small crew that were working under him. Let's go to lunch. We'll go over to the Mellon Gallery and across the mall. So we did, and we spent a lovely 2 hours there that first time, and then the next, and so on. So my lunch hours began to stretch out, and it was a marvelous experience. I was blessed to have such an association, but I had to leave the institution. My work deteriorated. I was very good at some things, and years later at a convention in Washington where I was, I connected with my old boss, and he said, the only thing we left from our years there, beginning the exhibits group, were the little figures you did to show scale on some of the patent models. I thought, well, that's nice. Anyway, my boss came to me one day and he said, well, I like you very much. We've always gotten along and everything, but you're ruining my record, my whatever you call scheduling. You arrive late, you have these endless lunch hours, you're never back on time, and you leave early. And you started wearing sandals in the summer, and you began to grow a beard. And, we have a dress code here. And you just have to conform to these things, and you're not going to. I can see that. Yeah. And I have a choice. You have a choice. And I said, oh, what's the choice? He said, you can leave now and forfeit your civil service of blessings. I don't know what you call it.
Benefits.
If you stay on 5 years, I think you become enrolled in it permanently with the benefits. But you're not going to stay on. So but you can just be fired right now. They turn you in the street. I don't know what else to say. I'll call it. Or I can reassign you to a rather distant post in the institution. Well, I said, oh, God, what am I going to do? Couldn't do anything except what I'd done, and that didn't earn anybody any money. And I said, all right, where do I have to go? He said, you better sit down. I said, well, where? Pierre, South Dakota.
Oh, goodness gracious.
I said, oh,
on the Missouri River.
That's Siberia. I've never even heard of the place.
American Siberia.
And I thought, oh, God. Well, I had to take it or leave, and so I took it. I hadn't been well for months. I don't know. Nobody, the doctors couldn't figure it out. I'd be sick as a dog for 2 or 3 days, and then recover, be all right, and then sick as a dog. Whatever it was, they couldn't figure it out. But I journeyed to Lincoln, Nebraska, which was the headquarters out there for the Smithsonian field workers. Spent a couple of weeks in Lincoln. This disease got worse, this disorder. The crowd that I was attached to were 2 archaeologists and 4 boys of muscle. I was one of those. And we were supposed to go north to a pier in a day or so. And after 2 weeks, we did. And I was appointed driver. And I was so sick that first day I could hardly hold the wheel. And Dr. Smith, I think he was, said, well, you're too sick to drive tomorrow. One of the other fellows can do it. You just lie down in the back seat and stay there, which I did. When we arrived in pier the second day, the already crew on site, it was a dig there at the Platte River trying to uncover Indian remains. And they had a banquet for us. Well, I was so sick I didn't know what I was doing. I grabbed my douche bag and I went over to the desk of the hotel where we were going to be billeted. I said, is there a doctor in the house? No. Is there a clinic nearby? No. I said, well, where can I get medical treatment? Well, you'll have to go over to the hospital in St. Mary's. I got a cab, I don't know where or how, and got over to the hospital and stumbled in there. And they said, oh, for God's sake, took a temperature. You've got to go in now. Your temperature is way up and you look terrible. I couldn't do it. I said, I can't. I have to go. I have a job. I don't know. I made some idiot excuse. I said, I can't. And I got back in the cab. It just happened to still be around. I said, take me to a motel. He did. I spent 3 nightmarish days in that motel. I don't think I ate much of it. Somebody brought me something once. I don't know, but my temperature was just raging. I could feel it. I was dying. I couldn't stand. But I contacted the hospital and they said, come now. So I did, went back. And they put me in bed immediately. And they couldn't figure out what was wrong. I was just so sick. I was really blind. Within a few days, very few days, maybe 1 or 2, I was conscious enough to realize lying in bed that standing beside me was the priest in his cassock with his purple stole reading a breviary. And I know he's reading the Right for the Dying. And I don't know, I don't remember anything. He apparently went out in the hall and said, this man isn't ready to die. He wants to live. Do something. And some doctors came in and horsed around, and they couldn't figure out what it was. And one of them said, well, did you try penicillin? It wasn't the original then, but it was just getting started as a cure-all. And they did. They injected penicillin, and the temperature immediately started down. And by 2 days, it was almost normal. And of course, I was so weak I didn't know what I was doing or couldn't. But I was taking nourishment in 4 more days and then moving around a little bit. And on the 2nd week, I left the hospital with my douche bag. Actually, Dr. Smith had brought over from the hotel my kit. And that was all I had. Everything I'd owned in Washington, I'd put in storage to be sent wherever. So I didn't have much to travel on. And there I stood outside the hospital, wondering where in the hell I was going to go. I didn't want to go back to Washington. I had nothing there. I certainly wasn't going to stay in New York. Oh, my God, no. Well, I'd had a lovely life in Santa Barbara. So I returned to Santa Barbara. And I have no memory of how I got there. I didn't walk. And I don't ever remember riding a bus. And I don't remember flying. I just don't remember. And I've had several gaps in my life like that. I can't remember those.
Fell into a memory hole, like a fugue.
Whatever. I was back in Santa Barbara.
I'm sorry. Did you ever figure out what was your illness? What was your malady? Did you ever get a diagnosis?
Yes, I did. It was strep throat, the same thing that killed George Washington. And I didn't find out then, but I subsequently, through another doctor, discovered the reason I was having strep throat, and I'd had a problem with it all my life. I remember having my tonsils out, age 5, and there was some medical problem there that I now recall. But the base of the tonsils, if you've ever seen tonsils, they're either side of the back of the throat before you descend into the esophagus or the larynx, and they move, had not been excavated deeply. So the root of the tonsil was still there, and it apparently was a wonderful stopping place for any kind of bacteria or virus or whatever came along in the air. And I caught everything that did. As a child, I was always sick. I wasn't an invalid, I was just always sick. And so on. But it had caught up to me. I nearly died. Well, I was not dead, and I was back in Santa Barbara. And we can leave it at that, if you want to, or whatever.
Yeah. So the historical figures, when did you really... You'd had some experience with them. You had some experience with the figures.
Well, I'd had a lot of experience with the figures. It was a Sunday, Easter Sunday, I remember in 1950 when I just got out of the college with my graduation. And all my friends were too overhung to be entertaining, so I had to do something. I had been... I had a very nice little residence there, a little bachelor apartment in the middle of Chinatown, and tiny room, not as big as this. And I had been working with the librarian there, Santa Barbara Library, in the division of images, photos, paintings, all the imaging, because I was good with images. And the librarian, a charming, gracious woman, I was assisting her to collate her vast quantity of images. And I had seen something that I remember from my long time ago, a photograph of a painting of a French king that, for reasons I'll never understand, this particular image captured my creative excitement. And
which French king? Louis XIV, or was it?
It was in this case Louis XVI in his coronation robe. I forget, it wasn't Rigaud. I can't think of the painter's name at the moment. And so I had nothing to work with. I didn't have any training in how to make things. I didn't have any tools, anything. But if you're creative in an intense way, you find a method. And I did, and I worked for better part of 2 weeks trying to make this object. I parenthetically had been inspired by my father's giving me in 1936, when I was whatever age I would have been, born in... I can't think when I was born. I was either born in 27 or 29. There's a debate about which.
Wow,
but whatever I was in 1936.
7 to 9.
We were traveling, and he gave me this for Christmas, this marionette, which I had never seen a marionette, and I was just transformed by it. It was just the most exciting thing I'd ever held. And I fiddled that to pieces, and in 1938, when we were settled in Pasadena then, I tried to make some figurines that moved and were articulated, like the marionette. I wasn't interested in strings. They came off immediately. I didn't care anything about that. It was just a figure that was articulated, fascinated me. So I made a pair of those. Well, of course, then time passed. I was doing other things, painting and going to school and working in the theater and various things. When as I say, that Sunday morning in 1950, I put myself together, and also this little figurine. And then it had to have a companion, so I did a companion figure, female. And that was the beginning of what we call today the historical figures. Now, we kept these, fortunately. They're in storage at the Ventura Museum. In fact, we have the earlier pair as well. Usually,
not on a permanent display, but
I don't think they've ever even seen them. They're not that kind of interested in the collection. But they're there to be preserved. And the original marionette was reconstructed. Anyway, so I was making figures in 1950-51, hand over fist. One of them turned out in one day. They were very crude. And we have a lot of pictures of these. That was before Mr. Dupree, who the famous photographer, was even born. And so I was building up this collection of figures in Santa Barbara. We even had a display of them through a dear friend in Santa Barbara at a local gallery, which was something. They were primitive, but I was graced to have people thought them was sort of nice or interesting, so let it go at that. But I'd had some experience of that nature when I had to go east to begin my career as a famous and important person in the diplomatic service.
And how did that turn out? How did your foreign service?
You don't have that out yet? I thought you'd done a little research here.
I have done a little, but I know it didn't pan out.
That's enough.
Yeah. Okay.
That sort of says it.
Is it you're sworn to secrecy?
Well, there's nothing secret about it. I didn't do it.
So you're back in Santa Barbara. You're making these figures. Now, how did it come up? Did you follow the ones did you just make the ones that you liked or found interesting? Or was it
at first,
yes.
basis? At first, it was a conglomerate of periods and attractive images of people. They were all attempts at a portrait. That was the only thing that distinguished. Well, not the only thing. I'm a modeler. I'm not a sculptor, and there are lots of people modeling, making figurines with articulation and other variations in the world, and some of them are absolutely brilliant. So I'm not unique in that respect, but what made mine a little bit different from most, I stuck with a specific scale. I instinctively went to the scale of that marionette, which had no scale, but to my eyes it did, and then the succeeding efforts all resulted in having a specific scale, quarter life size, and they were all endeavors at a portrait of somebody that existed. So most people don't have a they may do a portrait figurine somehow, sometimes, but mine were always about historical figures.
Now, how did you, some of these, when you go back, long before they had good representation, like Attila the Hun, 5th century, plains of Hungary, he had no representations. It's all second, third hand generations after. How did you do the research?
Oh, occasionally there's a woodcut or something that goes back, but we have had images of famous persons for thousands of years, cut in stone, if no other way, or the sarcophagi of the Egyptians, or the early Roman tomb portraits, Etruscans. Oh, brilliant. Brilliant. The Romans were brilliant at portraits in stone. So were the Greeks, pretty good. But the Romans perfected it. So we had plenty of information about most of the people you attempt to do. If they're totally without a single image, such as Anne Rutledge, her mother, they say, looked like her, and there was a photograph of her mother. So if you took the mother's bone structure and coloring that was described as red-haired and freckled and pale skin, typical redhead, and you translated it into a 20-year-old face, well, then you have your Anne Rutledge. And anybody want to argue with it? Oh, fine. You tell me a better one. I remember having a byplay on that subject, a very specific one, when I had done a portrait of many other, but a portrait of Louis XIII. And I forget the artist that I had used, but I completed the figure. It was out and about in the ether of today, whatever it's called. And somebody wrote me from Australia who'd been studying history and said, you have a totally wrong image for Louis XIII. Well,
how would he know?
Oh, there are plenty of portraits of him, for God's sake. He was well known, sculptures, everything.
Oh,
I thought,
what was wrong about yours?
How would I have made such an error? And I looked back and I thought, oh my God, yes, it's terrible. How could I have produced this thing? So we pulled it all apart, took the head off, and we reworked a new portrait. And it was pretty good then. It's always when you go back to portrait painting of the era after the Cinquecento, when portraiture is more realistic and it was more patronage and so on than public monuments. Every painter, Van Dyck was one painting of Charles and his wife. Another painting was Kneller. And his painters would do the same person. They are all different. So you look for a nose that works, or eyes that are the same, and all the portraits are the mouth. It's something about that.
Find some consensus.
And you do the best you can, and that's what all painters of the past, depicting the past, have done, I think, at least from my experience. Try to come up with what's his name, Columbus. It's always, you think you come up with the definite portrait, but Bettman Archive they like something from the 19th century. Somebody's done a steel cut. And of course, that's very accurate of Columbus. But, you do yours and hope it'll be accepted. And that's the way it works.
Yeah. Now, materials, how has that changed over the years that you've been doing them? I think you use art resin right now, or some kind of art resin or epoxy for the main bodies, and then go deep into the details.
No, I would steer away from something like that. I did try when I was at the Smith. I'd already been making figures. The worst material that I used to begin with was, I think it's called plastic wood. It may still be on the market. It was a very sticky, I don't know whether it was a resin then, but it would probably be comparable to a resin with wood sawdust. And you fill holes in the walls and sand them off and that sort of thing. It's terrible stuff to work with because it sticks to your fingers. Trying to model little heads with sticky fingers. It was a challenge, and it was very inflammable, I discovered, trying to dry them in a hurry in the oven.
Oh, goodness.
So,
you found out the hard way, huh?
Oh, yeah. Everything was done the hard way. Nobody was teaching me at my elbow.
Yeah.
Everybody thought, what the hell are you doing? Why don't you do something useful with your life? Well, I was doing these things. And I transferred to a substance called Marblex. It was a hobby craft material. I think Indiana. I forget where they made it. I think so. And it was a beautiful substance. It was a clay in a binder, water-based, and just lovely stuff to work with. And it was excellent for my modeling, and it dried beautifully. You could force dry it in the oven if you wanted to. And I did this over these plastic wood skulls I started out doing, everything. But then eventually I made an accurate skull generic female, generic male skull, and you can carve your skull to meet the bone structure of your subject. Anyway, I began to put my marble X over the earlier substance, and they made very nice heads, very nice completions. But of course, as time passed, the Marble X company went out of business. They sent me a 25-pound bag of this, the last substance in the whole outfit. It's yours, and good luck. So when that ran out, I moved to what was a German invention. It was used originally to help restore the body in open casket funerals, because it was mortician's wax. But that was not. It was an inspiration to somebody to make a polyform clay, and I think the trade name. I can't think of the trade name. Everybody uses it, and it modeled beautifully. But I'm a modeler who redoes everything. I don't do my first sketch is never the one I'm going to end up with. And in modeling, it's the same. So I have to rework things, and it's not good for that because you have to cook it.
Yeah, it has to be
cured. It's galvanized is what it is. Or no, not. What do you do with rubber? You vulcanize it. Well, once it's vulcanized, you can't do anything with it. And if you're not a good modeler, and some of these people are so brilliant, they get their models right the first time. Well, I couldn't do that. And I used that for several years. It was very frustrating. And it was very heavy. I did some full body sculptures. And it was extremely heavy. And it also, I found out, would craze just slightly. If the temperatures of your reworking weren't just right, you'd find fissures. Oh boy. Well, we had to deal with that later in life. And as soon as I could, I discovered, I can't think of his name, I think it was Foster. Young man I met at a convention, and he was doing Japanese art figures, just the most beautiful execution, details, exquisite stuff, traditional Japanese. He'd been studying in Japan. And he was using a substance. I said, what is this substance that you use? He said, it's called paper clay. I'd never heard of paper clay. Maybe I was the only modeler on the planet that didn't. But anyway, he was using it. And he showed me how, where, and when. And I found out the distributor for paper clay was right here in Oxnard, or not Oxnard. What do we have over here?
Ventura, Oxnard, Thousand Oaks,
No, I guess it was Oxnard. So I've never had any trouble acquiring the material, and it's just wonderful to work with. I found it wasn't quite as defined as the Marble X. Of course, that was gone now. I couldn't get any more. And we also found that the Marble X, once years passed, it crazed. And we spent many, many hours in this past few decades filling cracks on the original figures. But you can do it. Anyway, the paper clay took over. It's light. It's, it has a certain strength to it because it's paper fibers, actually cloth fibers, with paper. And it's beautifully conceived material to work with.
And it bakes up really nice and hard. Does it last a long time?
Oh,
long
absolutely.
Shelf life?
Well, I wouldn't submerge it in water.
No. But, so what was the first period of history, or what was like really your early fascinations? Like, what did you find?
Well, it stayed with French history. And I did a group of figures expanding my first couple. And that was the bridge to my beginning as a public speaker, because I found that I was having a wonderful time making figures. Some of them are Egyptian and Mesopotamian characters. And it was a wide variety, but I had this clutch of French. including Madame de Pompadour and Madame du Barry and all those characters that were fascinating to an amateur like myself, amateur historian. And I was worried that what was I going to do? I had a marvelous show in Stanford. I forget what year it was, 57 or something. A really slap-up affair. I forget the name of the gentleman who initiated this, but they were being very kind. They liked what I did, or whatever. And they engineered this program. So they were on exhibit at the Stanford Research Institute, which eventually had a terrible name for doing something dreadful. I don't know what, poisoning the world or something. But then they moved over to the Stanford Art Museum, I think it's called. And they were there for 6 months, and they opened the show with a black tie reception, and the Charge d'Affaires de France came down from San Francisco to make the opening speech, and I don't know what all. It was just a giddy affair. But then I was back in Santa Barbara and wondering what I was going to do with myself. And a semi-retired performer that we all had. In Santa Barbara, there was quite a mix of locals and retiring or retired performers from Hollywood and all over. And it was a very rich mix of theatrical experiences if you're working in Santa Barbara. At least it was then. I don't know what it's like now. And this person said, well, for goodness sake, stop fussing. Why don't you, you've been through 3 universities, you must know something about history. And you've been on the stage since you were 15, and you've had good training. Yeah, you're not afraid of any audience. Why don't you do that? And you've got all these little dummies you've been making of history figures. Why don't you go on as a public speaker in monology? It didn't use the term. And in the trade, it's called T's and A's, sort of vulgar, but something that would gather in the audience if you make it colorful and so on. And you can do that. And I thought, my God, I never thought of such a thing. Never occurred to me. I'd seen some monologies, but I'd never connected my own meager talents to it. And I was very fortunate, again, through a connection, to get an audition with Samuel Horton Brown Agency, which is the premier Speakers Bureau in Southern California. Margaret Mead, Frank Baxter, they had all these great people. Yeah. I was nobody. They gave me an audition. They said, all right, you're one of our artists. So that's how I began the public speaking business.
Well, what was the structure? Did you have like a tight 20-minute presentation or 40-minute, 50 minutes?
Oh, yes. Everything was very structured. We had hour and a quarter or hour and 45 with an intermission. Wow. And you had to condense your talk to fit that. And I remember after being out on the road for a while, my agent calling me in for a little meeting and saying, we do not talk about religion, politics, or sex in our speakers and presentations.
What's left?
And I wasn't thinking, and I didn't say anything, but I thought, oh my God, that's all I talk about. And I know when I was finally a veteran in this business, if you want to call it something, people, when I was still at the end of these programs, the figures rolled out on display on the stage. The people could come forward and look at them if they wanted to. And frequently people want to talk to you. And once or twice I was said, I wish you'd come and teach school because our little Johnny would just love to hear your history talks, and everybody, if history were taught this way, everybody would love it. I said, Madam, would the Board of Education let me say to the students what I've been saying to you tonight? Oh, well, maybe not. I said, well, that's what you're paying me to do, and that's why it's interesting, because I make it into an interesting drama. I'm not here to educate your children. And you just get to work on your schools. I'm not an educator. I'm a performer. And I never had any other illusion about it. Now, if somebody learns something about history after 45 years of monologues on the subject, I can't help it.
You can't help it. Well, that's purely incidental then. It's not the intent.
No, I wasn't trained to.
Yeah.
I have no qualification to do that.
Well, what are some of your early monologues, like the...
Well, the first one was the three Louis of France. And that
including Louis the 11th?
Louis the 14th, Louis the 14th, Louis the 15th, and Louis the 16th.
Oh, okay.
And their attendant mistresses, as it were, started out that way. Of course, it expanded over the years, and from 8 or 9, I forget how many there were in that first tall figures. It expanded to something like 16 French figures and in 4 different monologues, all based on French history.
Wow.
But we've been, Russians and China and
so you're working on your repertoire
English and so
all the time, I imagine. Working on your repertoire.
Oh, yeah, never let up. Every season there had to be a new show. And 8 to 10 figures every year. And, of course, after I'd been doing it for 20 years, we were mixing, matching, adding a few figures here and making it into a new program with older figures. It worked out all right.
Nice. Well, I noticed, as we're talking, the Napoleon movie, Ridley Scott's Napoleon movie just came out, which immediately divided people because you can see just in the trailer, like the French soldier shooting the nose off the Sphinx, which didn't happen. Also, Napoleon witnessing the beheading of Marie Antoinette, which didn't happen. He was not there.
Well,
so the movie is meant to be entertaining.
That's the point. It is, and people that want to mix art forms and compare them and then be disappointed because some art form is more appealing to them to another. No, Ridley wants to do what he wants to do, and he's always done it very well. And if the public don't like it, they don't have to buy tickets.
That's fair.
And they don't know anything about history anyway, so what does it matter?
Well, that's true.
Americans are not taught any history. Napoleon could be the Hunchback of Notre Dame, and they wouldn't know the difference.
Yeah.
It's too bad. I wish more people did, because it would help the present situation about, the lack of education about a number of things that our fellow citizens seem to be in need of, or more education. No, that was the third figure I think I did, was Napoleon. And then Josephine.
Napoleon of what period? Like before he was emperor?
In the decorative period, when he was still
a first consul?
I think probably that one, with the more attractive uniform, when as a young man, very elaborate.
Like the Italian
But then
campaign.
I did it over, and now he looks like the generic Napoleon that we all know and love.
Yeah. Well, we should love a Napoleon in America. That's one of my contentions, that if it were not for Napoleon and the French Revolution providing this major distraction, the British would have swallowed us right back up again. It's no coincidence that the British launched their invasion of America in 1814 after the contour of Napoleon's disastrous Russia campaign became clear.
Well, they had the men to do it then. They didn't have the forces to conquering America and fight Napoleon.
No, not both. Well, the British got off easy in the Napoleonic Wars because they were mostly the bank. Mm-hmm. They were providing the money.
Perhaps.
Yeah. Just a fascinating period, a whole idea of the rights of man versus the divine rule of kings. Mm-hmm. I just found that just like, that's where history happened. History on horseback. I think it was Hegel.
Actually, it was a matter of economic disasters in France that
started some bad harvests.
That was difficult for the French to negotiate after bankruptcy and their efforts in America to distract the British and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Well, they're helping us out in the Revolutionary War was expensive, and that was part of the hole that they dug themselves into. But yeah, you could see the structures of in the first National Assembly, when was that, like 1789, that things were going to fall apart. And when they fall apart, it usually happens very rapidly. I don't know. Did you ever do a figure of Danton?
I didn't. I had intention of expanding Robespierre as far as I got with that, because I had so many other areas that I had to look at if I was going to be diverse.
Well, Danton's had some essay about when he was a boy, he ran away from school or played hooky for a couple of days to go to Rouen, where they were having the big recoronation or some big fancy, royal event. And they had this carriage that was just the most Baroque thing imaginable, just all filigrees and silver and gold and just done up to a T. And he was thinking, wow, that's gone too far. This is like this purely decorative phase. There's no vital force left in. He was only like 14, maybe 12 or 13 years old at that time. And he could just see right away that the center would not hold. But he was smart. Danton's my favorite figure for the French Revolution.
Because he was a very impressive man.
Yeah, well, him in the tumbril going past the, Robespierre's office and shouting, "You're next." That was prophetic. These forces that people unleash and then they can't control, I said these forces that get unleashed, people get set in motion, these processes that overwhelm them and swamp them, and they get ground up beneath the wheels.
Well, I think in 2024 we'll find it closer to home in actuality.
Yeah, the death of democracy.
It'll be very entertaining in the next 20 years.
Yeah, I'm afraid. The kind of entertainment that's only amusing when you're not in it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Better, as they say in Silicon Valley, but you better run and break things, but
yeah,
elsewhere.
That's their mottos. What was it? Move fast and break things. Unfortunately, that's a recipe for disaster. Yeah. So what are some of your... Now, you've done like many hundreds of figures over your career. Do you have a total number? 500, 600?
Well, I think we've estimated there are over 400, but that's not a great number of anybody's artwork if you look at other artists.
Well, I don't know the detail and verisimilitude that goes along with that.
Well, depends on what your art form is, and some, I think, more of painters and sculptors dealing in reductive sculpture. They must take a great deal more time than it does do an oil painting. Yeah. It just stands to reason.
Who's your favorite artist? You mentioned
my favorite artist?
Yeah. Would it be somebody modern? Do you have?
Well, I don't have favorite artists. I just marvel at the work that's done by artists in the past, the skill and just mysterious wonder of how you can produce such a masterpiece. When I was painting, I couldn't do that, and that's what I wanted to do. I wanted my paintings to look like Titian, or at least John Singer Sargent, and didn't quite make it.
Well, you seem to have found your niche.
Well, I thought I'd found my niche. I didn't mean to have a niche, but, the public speaking was making a modest income out of an assortment of skills. I'm not the greatest modeler in the field, and I certainly am not the greatest speaker in the world. I mean, I'm no... what's his name? NPR.
Terry Gross. No.
Say again?
Well...
Garrison Keillor.
Oh, Garrison Keillor.
One of the greatest monologists of our time.
From Lake Wobegon, where
And, of course, Hal Holbrook, which I had the pleasure to see in his interpretation of Lincoln and Mark Twain. Yeah. Just these were masters of the monologue. None such ever. It's reduced to another favorite. Of course, I think that... what's her name? Who's retired now?
A performer.
Oh, yeah, she retired. She was in a TV series with Jane Fonda for a while.
Oh, Lily Tomlin.
Lily Tomlin.
Yeah.
When I saw her on the stage, it's just amazing. But it's a totally different thing. It's gone into high comedy or low, depending on your view, and stand-up amusement instead of, as I said, with Ruth Draper or Will, what's his name, with a robe in 1900.
I'm sorry.
Wilbur Hayes. Oh, anyway, there are a lot of speakers in the past who have been very brilliant, and it's a kind of monologue. They do.
Well, that's Mark Twain got his career started as
absolutely, and Dickens.
Before he was even a
Dickens wouldn't shut up. It was just wonderful.
Yeah.
He was simply a marvel on the stage.
Well, one of the reasons his novels got so long is he's being paid by the word. And so he had an incentive to, pad the content a little. But just those stories about, I'm not going to remember the name of the book, but there was a fresh batch of chapters that just got into New York Harbor, and there were like 400,000 people waiting on the dock to find out what happened to Little Nell or David Copperfield or whoever it was. It's hard to imagine an author or performer generating that kind of mass enthusiasm.
Well, I don't know. Today, they have more masses listening and paying attention to things than we have ever had before.
Yeah, the attentions are divided, though. It's hard to consolidate a huge audience.
Sure. Well, I think part of that is that the offering is so diverse and it's easy to be distracted.
Yeah. Well, there's something for everyone and nothing for everyone.
Oh, well, that's profound. I can't argue with that. Or as Oscar Wilde said, Americans know the value, the cost of everything and the value of nothing.
Yeah,
and I'm afraid our values are somewhat diluted by the largesse of stimulation, which is, we love the largesse, but we're unable to focus long on any one thing.
I guess I'm not a doomsayer. I believe that there's probably elements that are good to the fire hose of information that comes at us.
Well, I'm sure there's some good things.
I don't know what it is. I mean,
if you
just see atomization.
It's a little distressing if you spend an evening. I'm not on the internet, as Mr. Dupree has constantly reminded me that what a fool I am not to be on the internet, because I'm not able to enjoy all the wonderful things that has to offer. But I did have a resource for whatever the HBO and these things, and I enjoyed a lot of those programs. I couldn't find much enjoyment in the commercial offerings of CBS, ABC, NBC, and so on. With laugh tracks and these comedies. I'm not much on comedy, I'm afraid. I like a story with an edge. And I'm not much on reading novels. I just finished one that was quite entertaining, an author I'd never read before, but I'd been reading things about our current affairs, and I was feeling a little constipated, so I needed a relief, and I read a very entertaining novel. But otherwise, it would be Stephen King, and everybody's, all these these grand people that sneer at Peter King, Stephen King. But I've never read a an author who was able to capture their characters so completely and get with it. And of course, he's not for everybody. But I like stories with a good, sharp edge.
Yeah. What was the novel that you just finished? Do you have the name of
The Devil's Playground by Russell. I can't.
Russell Means?
Hmm?
Russell Means?
No, Russell is the last name. I forget the first.
Yeah. Well, I just finished Carl Sandburg's biography of Lincoln. Not the 7-volume one.
It's up there somewhere.
One, which, my office is right near the library carts behind the arcade, so there's always fresh batches of
Goodness sakes,
I have I don't even know, over 30 books on my backlog. But that one
But you like to add to some? I'm trying to give books away.
I wouldn't mind having a peek.
Take a book and run.
Yeah, I think I will. I'll just wait until your back's turned and then dash out. But I just found that, now you've done some Lincoln figurines. I think I saw one of a young Lincoln, like a rail splitter Lincoln, a Sangamon County, Illinois.
I actually had the pleasure of going to visit that. That was one of the things that my manager said, you've got to do something about American history. Enough of them kings and queens. And I said, in my wonderful way, well, that's what's so interesting. Americans don't know anything about what I'm telling them, something new and interesting. And this person said, no, you're entirely wrong. They want to know what they already know. They want to hear about what they already know about. And so telling them about Marie Antoinette, tell them about a baseball player, they know everything.
Yes.
And I thought, oh, God, I don't know anything about American history. I have the slightest interest in it. I had never done anything about Americans. Oh, I did some experimental figures. That's not true. In the beginning, I did a Washington and Jefferson and so on. So I thought, all right, well, I was on tour in the Midwest, and I had a few days in Chicago to kill, as I say. So I went down to Springfield. It was winter, February, and a hotel. And I went over to the Lincoln House and looked at that. And then I said, well, I've heard of this New Salem, because I'd been reading about the subject. I thought, well, I'll have to do Lincoln, That's what I have to do. But I didn't know anything. So here I was in Lincoln Land. And they said, well, they phoned up the park, and it was closed for the winter. And I said, oh, boo-hoo, boo-hoo. I've come all the way, blah, blah, blah. So the park management very modestly said, well, all right, if he can get out here, we'll open it up for him. Nice. So the hotel arranged for a limo, take me out in the snow. Of course, it was all up to our hips. And we went out to the New Salem settlement. It's about 15 miles, I guess, on the Sangamon River. And there it was. And, of course, the snow had covered everything to do with modern America, the latrines, the garbage bags, all this junk that we do with our parks.
So it was hidden.
And the only thing I had in life was the inn and the smoke coming out of the chimney. So we went over there, and they said, well, we'll show you around. And they showed us around. We tramped through the snow, looked in the windows. Here's the workshop, and here's the smith shop, and here's the place where we live, all these things. And then we were colder than hell. So I was with the driver. The we was myself and the driver. So they invited us in the inn to have some coffee and corn cake, and the fire and everything was more or less as it had been in the 1830s. And they were very gracious and told us little stories and this and that. And the whole event was spectacularly moving. When you think, of course, nothing is what it was then. We've always fiddled it into a Disneyland of some sort. But this was as rustic as I'm sure it was. It was pretty primitive. And I thought, here, I'm looking at things that he did. So being on site, and then to top it, I made an appointment at the Chicago Historical Society that I understood had some relics of his. They made an appointment with me. And I went up there, and was there on the day. And they said, "Oh, yes, we knew you were coming. Come this way." And they took me in a little room, not this big, with a chair and a table, and said, "You wait here, we'll be back." And, I don't know, 10 minutes later, one of the curators came in with their arms loaded down with clothing, hat, umbrella, and all these things, dumped them down on the table, and left. Oh, my goodness. Well, there I was with my notebook and my pencil, and I was making measurements of everything I could get my hands on, because that's what you do as a tailor. You have to measure things. And the hat.
The silk top hat?
I put it on.
Oh, wow.
And it came down over my ears. He had a 24-inch head, and I am a 22. And I thought, well, I've worn Lincoln's hat now. That's my major accomplishment in life. And everything else we measured, and there are no photographs. I'm not a photographer, and I've missed so many opportunities because I couldn't make pictures, but I could draw. So I made everything. And that was a wonderful experience. Now that I'm in the museum business, I realize that anything to do with Lincoln is now handled with gloves and a hazmat suit and under glass with the air sucked out, and nobody touches anything. And here I was rummaging around through his clothes and wearing his hat. You don't have experiences like that very often in your primary research. That was primary research.
Yeah.
And I don't get much done in the way of primary research. I let other people do the work.
Were you inspired to get some other any other Americans that triggered? So that was like...
Well, I think I found Benjamin Franklin's walking stick and copied that as far as a big deal. When I was working at the Smithsonian, I was working in civil history, out of civil history. Everything was sort of put together, slapdash. And there were racks of clothes. They were, here's Madison's coat hanging with Jefferson's coat. And they were on a rack the way you do in your closet. And shuffling through back and forth. And I didn't realize until much later what an opportunity that was when I was trying to address these characters.
So I'm wondering if you were, as you mentioned, you keep up with current affairs. Is there any particular historical period that you feel is being represented or that would be good for us to learn from at the moment? Some context?
Almost any.
Yeah.
I think Chinese history, when I got into that, what's his name, had just gone to China and discovered it.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, Americans don't know anything about China. I'll do one on China. Well, actually, I was going to do one on the Manchus, the Jing Dynasty. I didn't know that then. It soon came clear. When I started projects, I never knew anything about what I was doing until I got started. And I thought, oh, my God, everything unfolded in front of me. I had to go all these avenues of research and do things. And things came to me, just wonderful things, just miracle things were actually available, if want to call it that.
So,
and of course, doing Manchu homework was very complex. Not as complex as American Indian gear, but or Japanese formulaic historic dress. I've never seen such complex things. I didn't do a Japan thing. I was intending to do it and started, but there was a depression and the funding disappeared.
So what period of Chinese history do
you
think? Like the Warring States
Tokugawa. Is that what you're saying? What form? What
or of Chinese
period?
History?
Oh, Chinese Jing Dynasty, 1644 to 1908.
Yeah, was that the Dowager Empress?
That was her career was encompassed in that. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a fascinating.
Unfortunately, I found that I was up against things I couldn't possibly produce, and I again, I don't know if there are any deities around, but something led me to step by step find embroiderers in China who would embroider quarter life size embroidery for the figures' clothing.
So purpose built for you then?
Oh yes, every stitch.
Wow.
They're absolutely priceless. The museum has no clues to what they have there.
Wow.
But these things were just priceless. I don't know how many figures we had embroidery of that quality done on. We have, I don't know, I can't even estimate how many Chinese figures, we'll call them that, because we included a couple of moderns. Of course, Mao Zedong had to be included in the eventual expanded talk. And Chiang Kai-shek and his empress, Mei Sung.
Yeah. I have a friend who, he's passed now, but he worked under Chiang Kai-shek in China in 1939.
Yeah, that's
under
interesting
Stillwell. Stillwell was his boss. But they called him
General
Chek.
Stillwell?
I think so, yeah. General Joseph Stillwell.
I think his widow was here at the Gables, wasn't he? Or no, that's Patrick... what's her name? What's his name? Oh, another general's wife. Anyway,
but yeah,
it's an interesting history, and we've been so ignorant of. I remember during the war, he was a hero. Oh my dear! Well, now we know what a corrupt regime he led, and all them. Well, we know a lot about our leaders being corrupt as they die off. It's on TV every night.
Yeah, he got outfoxed by Mao.
Oh, that wasn't hard to do, was it?
No. Well, the Japanese, they agreed to stop the Civil War. So they let Chiang Kai-shek fight the Japanese, and then he retreated in the mountains. And
no fool them.
No, that was he was ready to take over China as soon as the war was over. They were so weakened. And then, I don't know, I wonder how long Taiwan will survive. It's going to be interesting. So the other question I like that, now we'll get out of here. You've been very generous with your time. I know we've been here for a while now. But grab and go. I do a little segment called Grab and Go, where if you were threatened by a wildfire or a flood or something.
Well, I was threatened by a wildfire. The fire came down to this road over here. And
it's not an obstruction.
I called up I don't know how I got their name, somebody with a truck and men. And my storeroom here housed, I don't know how many boxes of figures. I can't remember. The word 90 comes somewhere in my head. I don't know. There weren't 90 boxes. There were dozens and dozens of boxes of figures that belonged to the museum because the museum had taken possession of the figures back in 1979. And I simply was storing my recent confections and so on. And they had the original collection, and eventually if they got around to it, they would all be carted over there. And the fire was here, and I wasn't going to waste time calling up the museum to say, may I, and could we, and all that business. It's like dealing with the papacy. It moves very slowly. So I got the gang out here, and a fellow that had been helping me with work around the house, very good worker, and we just had them load all the figures into the truck and take them over. I said, take them right inside and dump them in the gallery. Don't wait for anybody to ask her. And they did.
Get them out of here.
Piled them all up in the middle of the gallery. And then we covered them with canvas. And
are they still there?
Oh, yeah. They couldn't do anything with them.
I'm going to take another chance with here because that fire moved quick, as you know.
Tell me about it.
Wow.
So now we don't keep anything on site. I have a lot of other art that I would like to get out of this house.
Yeah.
But it's difficult.
One other question I had was commissions. Do you do private commissions?
Well, I started doing a few, and then it blossomed into a nice income. and was doing very well. My patrons were, except for one couple, the patron, one of them was a woman, obviously. What was their name? Oh, you remember? Come on.
What, Peter?
He's
somebody local in Ojai?
No.
She don't have a museum of miniatures down in...
Yeah, of course, but he made his fortune on insurance.
I think had the car museum.
I can't think
of it.
Oh,
not... well, Leonard Davis started AARP's insurance. That's AARP started here.
No, it had nothing to do with local.
Well, this was nationwide.
Well, my point is that these were, I don't know how they knew about the figures. Why am I telling you this?
Because your private commissions we're talking about.
They saw the figures at the museum somehow and came over here for a visit. And they commissioned, I think the wife, I may confuse them with somebody else. I think she commissioned Henry VIII for her husband as a gift.
Wow.
They already had quite a collection of miniatures. I didn't know when that happened. And then they began to exhibit some of our in what do you call it, East Century City. Century City, their offices were a floor of one of those buildings in Century City. And when I finally went over to see what they were doing, the magnificent collection of miniatures of different kinds. And they began to show some of ours. And then they took the building across from the museum on Wilshire, the Museum of whatever Los Angeles called LA County Museum, which is undergoing reconstruction or whatever. The building across the way they rented, and they set up shop there for their miniature collection. And they had a permanent showroom for the figures. And so we were sharing figures back and forth with the museum here and there. And then ultimately they purchased the entire biography of Louis XIV. I don't know, there were 16 or 18 figures in that. And it was a wonderful group of figures. We really worked our little fingers off to make it. This is long before we were going to sell it to anybody.
Yeah.
But they purchased all of them. And then they purchased some extra ones. And then a couple of other gents in New York, they wanted military type figures, Roman soldiers and Greeks and
hoplites and centurions.
That's all that sort of thing. So I had a very nice thing going along until 2008, is it?
That was
the crash.
Yeah,
well, one of them went bankrupt, the other one was suicide, and so that took care of my New York clients. The chap up here in Seattle was a pretty good patron, and he stopped buying because who in the hell is going to be buying figures of all things? They require being under glass and out of the sunlight. They're a nuisance. So I'm always surprised. There was another, what was their name? Weiss. He was in the mercantile business in L.A. Something to do with the vegetable market. I can't remember now. And that wife also commissioned Henry VIII for her husband. He was very popular. I guess I've done 4 of those over the years.
Yeah, I guess he's so distinctive. And just, he's a burly fellow. Although when he was young, he was quite athletic and handsome, wasn't he? Henry VIII.
Well,
we see him now as this glutton. That's not the.
Well, I think. I can't think of the name of the portrait artist.
Hans Holbein.
Holbein, yes. His interpretation, I'll go with that. It's somewhere between the early portrait of him, which is unrecognizable, and the latest portrait, I guess, of Holbein's too, when he was very very heavy on looking his age, even though he wasn't that old. So this is a good in-between, and it's very decorative.
Nice. Anything else you want to talk about while I got you?
Well, you're the one doing the interview.
Well, I'm here to interview you, yeah. What do you want to talk about? I think a good way to end is just what lesson would you like to impart from what you've done through your deep study of historical representations? Do you feel like there's anything we need to keep?
Can you be more specific? What did you?
Well,
what in 3 words? What is it?
I mean, we were talking about people not knowing history in America. We just think of ourselves as this blank slate, and history has no meaning for us because we're reinventing ourselves all the time. That we have this cultural amnesia. So what does that mean for you?
You pretty well summed it up.
Yeah.
It's a sad thing to see such a lack of interest in anything that went on before. Probably the young people now, maybe the Vietnam War is ancient history, and before that it's blank. I think our lodestone of history will be the era between 2016 and 2030, when finally the dust is settling.
Yeah. Are you optimistic?
I'm not despairing. I think the American good fortune, I'm so glad I was born, and I don't mean anything racist here. I was born white and male and an American. I'm so fortunate, and I think everybody else who shares that trio is very fortunate.
Well,
we've been blessed with everything imaginable, and of course, it's how we've used or abused it that will be remarkable in the future's history of us. We have an opportunity to do so much, and unfortunately, sometimes we put our feet wrong.
Yeah.
But on other cases, we do a pretty good job.
Yeah. Just look around. I know we live in such luxury that Henry Ford or Napoleon or Louis XIV couldn't even imagine.
Well, I think of this every day. You're right on the money. I say I'm so blessed. I'm not going to complain about anything, and I'm complaining all the time, as my friends know. I'm a terrible critic and complainer, and but when it gets right down to it, aren't I lucky? Aren't you? Aren't we all?
Yes,
I think so.
All right,
and I've been very fortunate.
Yeah, that's a good place to end. Thank you, Mr. Stuart. That was really, really fun. Hey, it's Brett Bredigan, just thinking out loud. That was a tough interview for me, mostly because Mr. Stewart's a little hard of hearing, so trying to ask questions is problematic. Fortunately, I didn't need to ask many. He was, once he got going, he was a real accomplished, fluent speaker. Mind as sharp as I could imagine anyone that old having that cognitive function. The amount of history that he has managed to accumulate over his years, it's a little intimidating. I consider myself a history buff. I read a lot, fluent on most areas and periods. So, even for me, it was intimidating. I hope for you, though, a lot. I appreciate the importance of history as being the context for everything that goes on. Because you really don't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been. Anyway, that's it for this episode of Ojai Talk of the Town. We'll keep an ear up.